Benjamin Tallis has joined me today to talk about his book chapter titled Friedrich's Germany, Landscape Painting as Imaginary and Experience of Connectivity, in which he tries to help the reader understand how Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes work as imaginaries of German connectivity, and how they were a driver for new spaces of governance in the 19th century and beyond. But before we delve into this interesting topic, I would like to ask you to tell me a bit more about your own background and how it is you came to write a chapter for a book centered around the theme of connectivity.
Well, thanks very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about a chapter I enjoyed writing very much, and which I came to through effectively overhearing a conversation between Luis Lobo-Guerrero and Felipe dos Reis. Luis, one of the editors of the book, and Felipe, one of the contributors to it, both of whom I've known for some time. And I was wondering what their workshop was about when we were collected together in a beautiful place in Italy, the hard life of a scholar. We were collected together there on the northwest coast of Italy, and there were a series of workshops, and I was wondering what theirs was about. And over coffee, good coffee, Luis actually launched into what was a thoroughly compelling explanation of his workshop that I suddenly thought, wow, this might be the way to actually put a useful angle on a private passion that I've had that I'd never been able to explore in a scholarly way before. So hearing about connectivity and then reading what became the introduction to the book, I thought, really, yes, this is a way of shedding new light on one of the greatest painters of light, and also on his politics, which I think have been misunderstood and widely and variedly misunderstood over the years. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to bring together a purposive mode of analysis, so correcting this politics, with a different angle on IR as well, and to add a little beauty to this connection through introducing more people, hopefully, to Friedrich's work.
Excellent. And it's wonderful to hear that you were able to contribute what is essentially a passion project, if I understand correctly. Excellent. So you make the argument that through Friedrich's revolutionization of landscape painting, a united Germany was envisioned from a liberal nationalist perspective. I was wondering how big of a factor this was for the unification of Germany in 1871, as in, was it merely a cog in the machine, or through its new imaginary of connectivity, much more than that? So in other words, did it offer a vessel for the people to see a united future as possible?
That's a great question, and I think answering it properly would take probably the rest of the afternoon. So I'll try and do my best in a short space of time. No one's going to claim, certainly I'm not going to claim, that there is a direct causal connection between Friedrich's reimagining of landscape painting and the founding of the Kaiserreich in 1871 as a united Germany. That's not how the causality works here. So I think it's important to say a little something about that first before getting on to the specifics of Friedrich. In my work in this chapter and more generally, I tend to work with what's known as a model of resonant causality. So rather than a linear causality where A necessarily leads to B, resonant causality has it that certain acts, be those discursive acts or acts of visualization, or indeed certain practices or certain materializations, will make certain processes or phenomena either easier or harder. They'll make them either more likely or less likely to happen. And so in this case, what we can see is that Friedrich's landscape painting and the way it was received may have contributed to the conditions in which it was easier for more people in the German lands to imagine those lands as being connected and to imagine their place within that connected Germany as German subjects. Now, Friedrich was not alone in contributing practices and visual discourses to this situation at the time. There were all sorts of writers, philosophers, painters of different kinds, novelists and so on, as well as politicians and our more classically understood political actors, making similar cases in different ways. But what you can see is that eventually these things come together. If you like, the different instruments form the orchestra, And then the tune really begins to pick up and can be recognized and heard by more people. And that's when you start to then get moved towards particular kinds of communal understanding, which can be exploited by political actors such as Bismarck and others who were responsible for the more formal political aspects of German unification.
All right, understood. And that leads me rather nicely to another question, which I have for you. That is, throughout your chapter, you explain how Friedrich's work should not necessarily be viewed as separately, but as a connected whole through which people and landscapes were connected. And how it's up to the viewer, you give the spectator quite some agency, how it's up to the viewer to give it their own meaning, and in this case, make sense of the fragments from which the artist has composed the landscape on his canvas. Now, perhaps this is a silly question, but did Friedrich set out to have an oeuvre that symbolized this envisioned community of Germandom, or is it something that happened naturally and we can ascribe to the artist retroactively?
Another interesting question. I think it's difficult when the artist hasn't actually written something specific about this that has been recorded, or someone else hasn't directly ascribed that intention to him based on conversation at the time or so on, to say that that was deliberately the intent. So I'm going to stay away from doing that. But what we can see is that throughout his career, Friedrich painted different fragments of the German landscape. And while almost none of his landscapes is a mimetic representation of a particular view, what they do is they take different pieces of German cities, towns, villages, mountain ranges, plains, forests, and so on, and put them together. And this is quite a common process in landscape painting. It's often known as a world landscape. And I make the leap to saying, well, Friedrich does it so particularly that he makes a quote unquote German landscape out of fragments of Germany. Now, it's also important to remember that at the time, Friedrich was painting for quite an educated audience. And this audience was spread across the German lands. And there's very good evidence to show that there were readers of the Journal of the Elegant World, for example, across different parts of Germany, not only in the Protestant lands where Friedrich was mainly painting, but also in the Catholic provinces to the west and to the south. And the readers of these journals who read about his paintings, or those who could see them exhibited, or those who traveled to Dresden and to other places to see them, understood what was going on here. This was very clearly viewed in a way that people finding their belonging within a landscape, and a landscape that resonated to them as being something real and something that they could relate to from their travels around Germany. That was putting them in the context of being in belonging in that place. And you can also see this in some of Friedrich's paintings, where he puts people in classic townsfolk dress in the countryside. And so people contemplating the moonrise over the sea, for example. This shows people enjoying the countryside and having traveled to do so. So it's in effect their place as well. And this connectivity through emplacement and through understanding that you're not only in place in your one locale, but around these other parts of Germany, can be seen potentially to have quite an effect. It does require a lot of agency, and that's also why I talk about it being a liberal form of nationalism. And certainly it's not a chauvinistic form of nationalism, and I explain that in the chapter, and maybe we discuss that a little later. But it's also liberal in the sense that it requires agency, but it doesn't require atomization, and that makes it different from some readings of liberalism we've seen more recently in international relations and elsewhere too.
So an argument could be made that some intent was behind it if he knew his audience well.
Certainly could, yeah. And I mean, what was very clear in Friedrich's intent was to try and provoke an experience that replicates the experience of communing with nature and of being in nature. And I think Heinrich von Kleist put it particularly well when he said, what you expect to happen in the painting happens between you and the painting. And so there's that experience of connectivity that is there with the painting, which then extends to connectivity to the landscape. And if you replicate that across different landscapes, then it cumulatively has an effect. And if also you replicate it across different viewers, then that has an effect. So if you and I were both to look at it, we may experience something similar. And so that implies both a subjective view, but also a commonality view, which is all what artistic affect is all about, really.
Which was also, of course, very well articulated through the Rückenfiguren, the people in his paintings of whom you could only see the back and essentially insert yourself, right? And experience the painting.
Yeah, exactly so. And nicely put. That's right. You are in the place of the Rückenfigur figure. You are there. You are transplanted into the painting. And I think this was another point that von Kleist was keen on. He expressed it in a number of different ways, including talking about viewing with your eyelids removed. So it's not that you can close your eyes and see the painting go away. It's you are in the painting there. You are there, and you are having the experience of nature. And it's an experiential thing. It's not just a visual thing. It's that feeling that is deeply important for this. And that was a big part of the Romantic movement, of which Friedrich was the leading painter in the German lands, at least. And that provocation of feeling is essential to this.
All right, very good. Now you seem very eager to talk a bit about how his painting should certainly not be viewed as chauvinistic kind of nationalism, trying to tie the people together. So perhaps you would like to say a bit more about this, explain the argument it's I think the underlying argument and probably the reason why you wrote this chapter, and perhaps you can quickly sum it up, prove the people wrong.
It's always good to go against, isn't it? No, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons I wrote the chapter. It's rather overdetermined. I mean, the engagement with the beautiful works and works that mean a lot to me was probably at the heart of it. But also, indeed, seeing this injustice that I felt had been rather done to Friedrich's work. It's no secret that his work was popularized by the Nazis, or was revered by the Nazis as an example of the kind of Blutenboden, blood and soil nationalism of Germans in German landscapes that they were trying to promote. However, that's an extremely reductive reading of Friedrich's work, which was all about indeterminacy and all about the different kinds of feeling that could be provoked. Indeed, co-feeling with other people from a nation, but that has to be understood in the context of the liberation wars of the 19th century. And in Germans actually seeking to escape the yoke of an oppressive occupier rather than necessarily seeking to oppress others. And what I think a lot of analysts and experts of the 20th and 21st century do is pretty much read a straight line back from Nazism to Friedrich and to a form of nationalism that would necessarily lead to Nazism. And that's simply not the case. And we know that there was a liberal national movement in Germany. And also Friedrich identifies with this explicitly. In some of the writings we do have from him, and in quite a lot of the recorded conversations he has with others, he talks in a very liberal way. So in the two men contemplating the moon, he's famously said to a critic, they're plotting demagogic intrigues. And this was a specific reference to criticizing the so-called Carlsbad decrees, which the Austrian Empire, and particularly Prince Metternich, had introduced after the Napoleonic insurrection in order to quell liberal political dissent. And demagogue was used particularly to refer to liberals at the time. So with Friedrich putting his characters in their Altdeutsch costume, their sort of emergent national costume, plotting demagogic intrigues, you see a politics against the Carlsbad decrees and in favor of a liberal form of nationalism. And he also talks about a constitutional form of nationalism, a constitutional form of self-determination for individuals who he sees as not being able to be free, quote unquote, as long as they're ruled by princes. And there's a series of these kind of quotes that show you that there's a real individual freedom element to this. And I think that's, sorry, just to finalize the thought, I mean, it's interesting how probably the most sophisticated analysis of Friedrich's work by a wonderful art historian called Josef Leo Kerner, it goes through 11 chapters, which are stunning in their intricacy as well as their balanced view and the nuance that they provide, and then collapses it all in the 12th chapter, where even the tiniest painting of an alder bush are considered to be fragments of Germany's darkest past. And at that moment, I think the shark has been well and truly jumped, and we need to sort of row back in and recover what we can of the brilliant analysis that precedes it. And to understand that while some of Friedrich's fellow travelers, like Ernst Moritz Arndt, for example, were indeed the kind of nasty nationalists that we would associate with tendencies toward Nazism, neither Friedrich nor his paintings can be viewed that way.
Understood. And this takes us rather nicely full circle, because once again, not everywhere and everything can be seen as a linear progression from his works to Nazi Germany. And then I have one more question for you. in your conclusion, you say you have attempted to romanticize the world regarding Friedrich's connected and liberal Germany. An artist, as you say, viewed by many through the lens of his appeal to Nazi Germany. Now, regardless of how you view Friedrich's work, and honestly, at the risk of sounding banal, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you anyway, should we, the public, the spectators of art, separate the art from the artist? What is your opinion on this age-old question?
Wow, you've ambushed me with that one. Good. All right. Yes and no, obviously. Right. I think we need to understand, particularly in work that is to a certain extent literary, one has to understand the artist's intention as much as we can, or you have to understand the contextual frame and wider referential frame within which he's working. So I think you have to understand the artist in their time and in their place. And so that's why in the chapter I talk a lot about this so-called Ramdor-Streit, the conflict with the Baron von Ramdor, one of the leading art critics at the time, who castigates Friedrich for violating every dicta of classical academic painting at the time, which was precisely Friedrich's intention. And you don't get the significance of that without understanding the artist in his time and his place. And you don't understand why an impossible landscape like the Cross in the Mountains, which really does look quite banal today if you just glance at it. It's not going to offend anyone. But at the time, wow, this set everything alight. So you need to understand the artist in that way, and you need to try and understand the artist's intention to a degree. However, the works themselves necessarily also transcend the artist, and particularly works like this, which seek to provoke a reaction. And this is where the connectivity comes in as well. Much later in the 21st century and the back end of the 20th century, there was a theory developed called relational aesthetics, which is all about the relation between the viewer and the work, as well as between the artist and the work. And Friedrich was well ahead of this, as many other artists were. We sort of caught up with the theoretical game much later. But that relationality that observers at the time talk about, and that consistently the best viewers of Friedrich's work and the best analysts of Friedrich's work have talked about ever since, that necessarily goes beyond the artist. And it relies upon, to a certain extent, an educated audience, or an audience willing to open their inner eye, as Friedrich would have called it, and to open themselves up to the feelings that are provoked, as well as just seeing a tree in a field. What else do you see, and what else, crucially, do you feel when you're viewing the painting? And that it takes on an interesting additional dimension when you take that experience out of the gallery. And many of us have had this in the last year and a half, not being able to go to galleries, but to seeing things displayed on screens in particular. Can you provoke that same kind of affect? And obviously this is an issue that critics as far back as Walter Benjamin and others have talked about. Art in the age of its mechanical and now indeed its digital reproduction. What effect does that have on the affect of art, and how does that affect the relation between the art and the artist?
Absolutely. And it's good to keep in mind also that even though everyone is looking at the same painting, everyone is looking at it from a different perspective, whether a different perspective in space or in time. And so it's hard to predict as an artist how your art will be viewed in 100, in 150 years, let alone even more. So I think you make a good point.
Very, very so. And that, I mean, but then of course, all of us viewing it now view it with, to a greater extent of knowledge of the past viewings of it as well. And those sort of layers of accreted meaning. It's much like when we go and see a Gothic cathedral today. There is still an awe-inspiring effect if you're willing to give it a chance. It's not the same awe-inspiring effect as for an illiterate farmer in the 12th century going to see this, where they would get their news to an extent from the stained glass windows, or they would get their spiritual enlightenment from that. We see it in a different way, but we carry that with us as that this has been an awe-inspiring thing for nearly a millennia. And so there's that weight of historical accreted meaning on you as well, which adds something too.
Indeed, absolutely. I wish we could talk longer, but unfortunately I have to cut us off there for time. So Benjamin, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully until next time, that's where I'll cut the interview. And
tremendously, thank you very much indeed. That was great. Keep this in, because I want to say to people, go to Berlin, go to Dresden, go and see the works, go to Hamburg, see them up close if you can. And thanks very much. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Very good. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.